Chapter 1. The Boy from Leningrad. In 1952, a boy named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born in Leningrad, the city now called St. Petersburg carried deep scars from World War II. The war had left buildings in ruins. Food was scarce. The people had survived bombings, hunger, and fear. But the city stood strong, just like its people. Among them was a small family living in a communal apartment where several families shared a kitchen and bathroom. This was where little Vladimir grew up. His parents, Maria and Vladimir Putin, had suffered much. His father had been injured in the war, and his mother had barely survived the siege of Leningrad, a brutal blockade that lasted 900 days. Food was rationed. Many had starved. Vladimir's mother once fainted from hunger, and only luck had saved her. After the war, life didn't become easy. The city was rebuilding, and so was the Putin family. They lived simply. They had enough to survive, but not much more. As a child, Vladimir was small and thin. Other boys teased him. They called him names and tried to fight him. At first, he was often beaten. He would run home with tears in his eyes, but instead of giving up, he made a decision. He would learn to defend himself. At the age of 12, he joined a judo club. The gym was old, with mats that smelled of sweat, but it became his second home. Every day he practiced. He learned discipline, strength, and control. In judo, his coach said, "You don't need to be the biggest. You need to be the smartest." Those words stayed with him. Vladimir wasn't the best student in school at first. He didn't care much for books or homework. His teachers said he was distracted and mischievous. He often skipped class to play with friends or explore the streets. The neighborhood where he lived was rough. Boys fought for fun, and trouble was always nearby. But something changed when he reached his early teens. He realized that if he wanted to succeed, he had to be serious. He began to study harder. He read books and focused on math and languages. One subject that fascinated him was history. He loved hearing stories about Russian heroes and great leaders. He imagined himself one day being important, doing something that would make others respect him. He didn't know how it would happen, but the dream was there, quietly growing inside him. Vladimir's father was a strict man. He believed in discipline and hard work. When Vladimir misbehaved, his father punished him, but he also taught his son important lessons. Never show weakness, he told him. Respect yourself, and others will respect you too. His mother was softer. She was loving and warm, though life had made her cautious. She worried about her son getting into trouble, but she believed in him. One winter day, a neighbor challenged young Vladimir to a fight in the snow. The boy was older and stronger. A small crowd gathered. Vladimir was nervous, but he didn't back down. The fight began, fists flying. For a moment, it looked like Vladimir would lose, but then he remembered his judo lessons. He used a quick move and threw the older boy to the ground. The crowd cheered. It was a small victory, but for Vladimir, it meant everything. He had proved to himself that he could win. As he grew older, his curiosity about the world deepened. In school, he developed an interest in politics. He watched speeches on television and read newspapers. The Soviet Union was a powerful country, and he wanted to understand how it worked. His teachers noticed his new attitude. One of them, a history teacher, encouraged him. "You have potential, Vladimir," she said. "You could do something great one day." Those words stayed with him. Outside school, he continued to train in judo. The sport became more than just self-defense. It became a way of life. He competed in tournaments and earned medals. But judo wasn't just about winning. It taught him patience, strategy, and resilience. When he lost a match, he analyzed what went wrong and improved. Losing didn't scare him anymore. It motivated him. At home, his parents hoped he would find a stable job after finishing school. Many young men went to work in factories or joined the military. But Vladimir had bigger dreams. He didn't tell anyone, but he admired the KGB, the Soviet Union's secret intelligence agency. He liked the idea of working in the shadows, gathering information, and protecting his country. To him, it seemed exciting and important. But how could a boy from a working-class family join such a prestigious organization? One evening, while walking home from practice, he passed by the KGB office in Leningrad. He stopped and stared at the building. It was large and intimidating, with high windows and guards at the entrance. He imagined himself inside, wearing a suit, solving complex problems, and making important decisions. One day, he thought, I will be there. It was a bold dream, but he believed in it. Life continued with its ups and downs. The family still struggled with money, but they made do. His father's health worsened over the years due to his war injuries, and his mother worked tirelessly to support the family. They didn't live in luxury, but they had each other. As high school came to an end, Vladimir had a decision to make. His friends were planning to enter local universities or join the military, but he had a different path in mind. He wanted to study law. He knew that understanding the legal system would be useful for the career he envisioned. He applied to Leningrad State University, one of the most respected schools in the country. To his joy, he was accepted. University life was challenging but exciting. He worked hard, made new friends, and impressed his professors. But deep down, his ambition burned brighter. He wasn't just a law student. He was preparing for something bigger. He kept training in judo, sharpening both his body and mind. He stayed focused, never forgetting where he came from or where he wanted to go. By the time he graduated, Putin had transformed. The shy, small boy who had once run from fights was now confident, disciplined, and ready to take on the world. But his journey was only beginning. Behind the calm exterior, he was waiting for the right opportunity, an opportunity to prove himself and make his mark. And soon, that opportunity would come. Chapter 2. A young man joins the KGB. Vladimir Putin had dreams, but not ordinary ones. He wanted a life of action and purpose. He didn't want to work in a factory, nor did he want to be a simple government worker. he craved something bigger. His interest in law and history had guided him, but there was something else, something secretive and exciting. He wanted to join the KGB, the Soviet Union's powerful intelligence agency. The KGB wasn't just an organization, it was a symbol of strength and control. The people who worked there were seen as protectors of the nation, but they were also feared. They dealt in secrets. They worked in the shadows. They gathered information, stopped threats, and ensured that the Soviet Union remained powerful. To many young men, the KGB was a mystery. To Vladimir Putin, it was a goal. When he finished university in 1975, Putin applied to join the KGB. It wasn't easy. The agency only accepted the best. They wanted people who were intelligent, loyal, and able to stay calm under pressure. Putin fit the profile. He was disciplined from his years of judo. He had studied hard in school and learned to speak German fluently. His quiet nature and ability to stay unnoticed worked in his favor. He wasn't flashy or loud. He could blend in anywhere, and that's what they needed. When he was accepted, he felt pride, but also fear. What would his new life be like? His training began immediately. It was tough and demanding. He studied espionage, how to gather intelligence, and how to avoid being caught. He learned to disguise himself, to create false identities, and to send secret messages. His instructors taught him how to analyze people, how to spot lies, understand body language, and predict behavior. Information is power, they told him. He listened carefully. But the KGB wasn't just about learning skills. It was about loyalty. Agents were trained to follow orders without question. They had to put the country above everything, even family. Putin understood this. He knew that being a spy meant making sacrifices. It was dangerous work, and trust was everything. If you made a mistake, the consequences could be severe. After his training, Putin was sent to work in Leningrad. At first, his assignments were small and routine. He collected reports, monitored citizens, and followed suspects. But he was patient. He knew that every small mission was part of a bigger picture. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. His superiors saw his potential and decided to give him bigger responsibilities. In the early 1980s, he was sent to Dresden, a city in East Germany. The Cold War was in full swing. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a battle of ideologies. Spies worked around the clock, gathering secrets from both sides. East Germany was a key location for Soviet intelligence operations. Putin's job was to gather information on Western governments, military strategies, and anyone who posed a threat to Soviet interests. Life in Dresden was different. He lived in a small apartment and kept a low profile. He often pretended to be a simple translator or cultural officer. His work required him to meet people, gain their trust, and collect information. Sometimes this involved long conversations over coffee. Other times, it meant sitting quietly in the back of a room, listening to every word being said. He wrote detailed reports and sent them to his superiors. Some of the information he gathered was useful. Some wasn't. But he knew that even small details could make a big difference in the world of espionage. Being a spy wasn't like in the movies. There were no car chases or glamorous parties. It was a life of waiting, observing, and staying one step ahead. Sometimes it was boring. Other times it was terrifying. There were nights when he felt the weight of fear pressing down on him. What if he was caught? What if someone betrayed him? He had seen what happened to spies who made mistakes. He knew the risks. One night, he had a close call. A contact he was supposed to meet didn't show up. Something felt wrong. He waited for an hour, then decided to leave. As he walked back to his car, he noticed two men following him. His heart raced. Were they watching him? He kept calm, turned down a narrow street, and quickly entered a building. He took the back exit and disappeared into the night. He never found out who they were, but the experience stayed with him. In the world of espionage, you could never be too careful. In 1989, the world began to change. The Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West Germany for decades, was falling. Crowds gathered in the streets, chanting and tearing it down. For the people of Germany, it was a moment of hope and freedom. But for the Soviet Union, it was a sign of weakness. The control they had maintained over Eastern Europe was slipping away. Putin watched the events unfold with mixed emotions. He understood that the world was shifting, but he didn't know what it would mean for his future. One evening, protesters surrounded the KGB building in Dresden. They wanted to break in. Putin called Moscow for instructions, but no one answered. He had to act on his own. Calmly, he ordered the guards to burn sensitive documents. The building couldn't be defended, but the secrets couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The Soviet Union's power was collapsing. By the early 1990s, it was clear that the old system would never return. Putin returned to Leningrad. His time as a KGB agent was ending. The organization itself was being restructured. Some of his colleagues left the service and struggled to find work. Others adapted to the changes, finding ways to use their skills in the new world. Putin was at a crossroads. He had spent years serving the Soviet state, but now that state no longer existed. He thought about his future. What could he do next? His skills in strategy, analysis, and negotiation were valuable. But where would they take him? He didn't know it yet, but his time in the KGB had prepared him for something much larger. His years of observing people, making decisions under pressure, and staying calm in chaos would soon be tested in a new and unexpected way. As Putin left behind the world of espionage, he carried with him the lessons he had learned. Trust no one fully. Stay patient. Seize opportunities when they come. And most importantly, never show weakness. Soon, his life would change forever. But for now, he was just a man, standing in a city trying to rebuild itself, wondering what lay ahead. Chapter 3. The Fall of the Soviet Union. It happened slowly, then all at once. By the late 1980s, cracks had appeared in the Soviet Union. The economy was weak. People stood in long lines for bread. Factories produced goods no one wanted. The government had lost control. Protests spread in Eastern Europe. In Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, people demanded change. The communist system that had ruled for decades was falling apart. In Moscow, leaders debated what to do. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, tried to reform the country. He wanted to fix the economy and give people more freedom. But it was too late. The old system couldn't be saved. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. It broke into 15 independent countries, including Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. The world was shocked. The Cold War had ended, and the Soviet Empire was gone. For Vladimir Putin, this was a turning point. He had served the Soviet Union with loyalty. He had trained as a spy, followed orders, and believed in its strength. Now, that country no longer existed. It was replaced by chaos. When the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time, millions of people felt lost. Life in Russia became difficult overnight. The government was weak, businesses closed, factories shut down, jobs disappeared. Inflation made prices soar. A loaf of bread cost more in one day than it had the week before. People's life savings became worthless. Pensions that once supported retirees couldn't buy enough food. Families struggled just to survive. Crime increased. Gangs fought for control of cities. Corruption spread through every part of society. Politicians made deals in secret. Wealthy men, known as oligarchs, took over industries like oil, gas, and steel. They became rich quickly, while most people remained poor. Some called it the Wild 90s, a time when everything seemed out of control. Putin was not a man who liked chaos. He preferred order, discipline, and stability. But now, the old rules were gone. He had left the KGB in 1991. Like many former agents, he faced an uncertain future. What could he do next? He had no money, no powerful friends, and no clear plan. He was married, with 2 young daughters to support. The pressure on him grew every day. In St. Petersburg, where Putin had returned after leaving the KGB, life wasn't much easier. The city had changed. It was no longer the proud industrial center of the Soviet era. Factories were closing, and the streets felt different, more dangerous. There was hope in some areas, but despair in others. People drank more, fought more, and trusted less. Putin needed work. He couldn't afford to wait for the perfect job. He accepted a position at Leningrad State University, where he had once been a student. He worked in the administration, helping manage foreign student programs. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. For a while. But fate was about to intervene. One of Putin's old connections, Anatoly Sobchak, had become a key figure in the new Russia. Sobchak had been Putin's professor during his law studies. Now, he was the mayor of St. Petersburg. He remembered Putin as a hard-working, reliable student. When he needed someone he could trust, he called Putin. In 1991, Sobchak offered him a job at City Hall. Putin became an advisor on foreign affairs and trade. His job was to attract investment from outside Russia. St. Petersburg, like the rest of the country, needed foreign companies to help rebuild its economy. Putin negotiated deals and built relationships. He worked long hours, learning how to navigate the new political system. It was different from the KGB. There were no clear orders. Instead, Putin had to be flexible, adapt, and find solutions. But corruption was everywhere. Some officials used their positions to steal money and power. Putin saw it firsthand. He knew how dangerous it could be. Yet, he remained loyal to Sobchak and stayed focused on his work. He avoided drawing attention to himself. In a city filled with ambitious politicians, this was smart. While others fought for the spotlight, Putin built quiet connections behind the scenes. One deal in particular tested him. The city was short on food supplies, and people were growing desperate. Putin helped organize an agreement to trade raw materials for food from abroad. But when the food shipments arrived, much of it was missing. Rumors spread that officials had stolen or mismanaged the supplies. An investigation was launched. Putin faced accusations but denied any wrongdoing. The investigation ended without charges, but the event taught him a valuable lesson. In politics, perception is everything. Even when you do your job, you can be blamed. As the 1990s continued, Sobchak's popularity began to fade. The economy wasn't improving fast enough. Protests grew against the mayor. In 1996, Sobchak lost his bid for re-election. This was a blow to Putin. His political future seemed uncertain again. Without Sobchak, he had no powerful allies. He briefly worked for Sobchak's successor, but soon realized it wasn't a good fit. Once again, he found himself searching for his next opportunity. But Putin had something valuable: experience. He had learned how to manage crises, negotiate deals, and navigate political chaos. He had built a reputation for being reliable, disciplined, and tough. Moscow took notice. In 1996, Putin moved to the capital, accepting a job in the presidential administration. It wasn't a high-profile position, but it was a step in the right direction. He worked quietly, just as he had in St. Petersburg. His colleagues appreciated his loyalty and ability to get things done without drama. He wasn't flashy or loud, but he was effective. By 1998, Russia was facing yet another crisis. The economy collapsed again. Banks failed, and millions lost their savings. President Boris Yeltsin was under pressure. His approval ratings had plummeted. He needed help. Someone who could bring stability and strength to a struggling government. His advisors suggested Vladimir Putin. Putin's move to Moscow was no accident. He had climbed the political ladder step by step. He didn't rush. He knew that patience was key. The skills he had gained in the KGB in St. Petersburg had prepared him for this moment. The fall of the Soviet Union had been a disaster for many, but for Putin, it was also an opportunity. The chaos had tested him. He had learned to survive. Now, he was ready for something bigger. Little did he know, His next position would be the one that changed his life, and Russia's, forever. Chapter 4. A Step into Politics. In 1991, St. Petersburg was a city of change. The Soviet Union had fallen, and the city was struggling. Businesses were closing. People worried about food and jobs. The future seemed uncertain. But in the middle of this chaos, one man saw an opportunity. His name was Anatoly Sobchak, the city's new mayor. He had a vision for St. Petersburg. He wanted to rebuild it, making it a modern, strong city. But he needed help. That's when he turned to Vladimir Putin. Putin and Sobchak were not strangers. Sobchak had been one of Putin's professors at university. He had seen potential in the quiet, serious student. Now, he needed someone who could be loyal and dependable. Putin seemed like the perfect fit. He wasn't ambitious in a flashy way. He didn't chase the spotlight. He worked in the background, solving problems without seeking attention. Putin became Sobchak's deputy. His job was to handle foreign trade and investment. St. Petersburg needed deals with foreign companies to bring money into the city. Factories were failing, and stores had empty shelves. Western businesses could help, but someone had to build those connections. Putin did just that. He negotiated contracts and worked long hours. He met foreign officials, businessmen, and investors. Putin's quiet but firm personality impressed them. He wasn't charming like other politicians, but he was practical and reliable. He didn't make empty promises. If he said he would deliver something, he did. Soon, people began to notice him. They saw him as a man who could be trusted. But politics in St. Petersburg wasn't clean. Corruption was everywhere. Some officials stole money or made illegal deals. Putin had to be careful. He knew that one mistake could ruin him. So he kept his head down and focused on his work. He avoided scandals and conflicts. When others were busy trying to gain power, he was busy getting results. One of his most important tasks involved food. The city had a food crisis. Supplies were running low and people were getting desperate. Sobchak's administration needed to find a solution fast. Putin helped organize a deal with foreign companies to trade raw materials for food. The agreement seemed simple. Russia would send oil and timber abroad, and in return, food would be delivered. But something went wrong. Some of the food never arrived. Rumors spread that officials had stolen or mishandled the shipments. An investigation began. Fingers were pointed at many people, including Putin. It was a tense time. If he were found guilty, his political career would be over before it had even started. But the investigation ended without charges. Although the event damaged the mayor's office, Putin's reputation survived. He learned a valuable lesson from that crisis. In politics, perception was just as important as reality. Even if you did your job well, you could be blamed if something went wrong. From that point on, Putin became even more cautious. He made sure that his name stayed out of the headlines. When others were making speeches or giving interviews, he stayed silent. He understood that power didn't always come from being in the spotlight. Sometimes it came from working behind the scenes. Putin's loyalty to Sobchak was tested in 1996. The mayor was running for re-election, but his popularity had fallen. Many people blamed him for the city's problems. Opponents accused him of failing to improve life in St. Petersburg. The election campaign was bitter and competitive. Putin worked hard to support Sobchak. He managed the campaign's legal and organizational details. But despite their efforts, Sobchak lost. This was a major setback for Putin. Without Sobchak, he was out of a job. His political future seemed uncertain again. He considered leaving politics altogether. But fate had other plans. His reputation for loyalty and effectiveness had reached powerful people in Moscow. One of them was Pavel Borodin, an influential figure in the Kremlin. Borodin was impressed by Putin's work in St. Petersburg, and offered him a position in the presidential administration. Putin accepted the offer and moved to Moscow in 1996. It was a big change. Moscow was the heart of Russian politics. The city was full of powerful men fighting for influence. But Putin didn't rush to compete with them. He stayed true to his style, quiet, patient, and disciplined. In Moscow, he worked under Borodin and later joined the Kremlin's property department. His job involved managing the assets of the Russian government, including important buildings and land. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was important. Once again, Putin showed his ability to handle responsibility without making mistakes. His superiors noticed his efficiency and loyalty. Over time, he formed connections with key figures, including Boris Yeltsin's inner circle. Yeltsin, the president of Russia, was facing major challenges. The economy was collapsing, and his popularity was declining. The government was unstable, and Yeltsin needed trusted people around him. In 1998, Putin was appointed deputy head of the presidential administration. It was a significant promotion. But his biggest opportunity came when he was chosen to lead the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor to the KGB. This was a critical role. The FSB handled national security, intelligence, and counterterrorism. For Putin, it was like returning to his roots. His training as a former KGB officer gave him the skills he needed for the job. As head of the FSB, Putin gained even more influence. He had access to sensitive information and was trusted by the president's team. But even then, he kept a low profile. He wasn't a man who sought media attention. Instead, he focused on building relationships and making sure he was seen as dependable. Some say his rise in politics was due to luck. Others say it was his skill in staying unnoticed while building powerful connections. The truth is, it was a combination of both. Putin knew when to step forward and when to stay in the background. He understood timing. By 1999, Russia was in crisis again. Yeltsin's government was weak, and many believed the president would soon step down. Behind closed doors, discussions began about who would replace him. Putin's name was mentioned, but few people knew much about him. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a public figure. But the people who did know him trusted him. His moment was coming. After years of patience and hard work, the quiet man from St. Petersburg was about to take center stage. Chapter 5. Yeltsin's Choice. In the late 1990s, Russia was a country in crisis. The economy was collapsing. Factories had closed. People were losing jobs. Many had no savings left. Banks failed, and food prices rose. For ordinary Russians, life was hard. Hope seemed distant. Corruption was everywhere, and crime ruled the streets. The government, led by President Boris Yeltsin, was weak. His health was poor, and his popularity had fallen. Protests filled the cities. People demanded change. Inside the Kremlin, Yeltsin and his team knew they had a problem. The country needed strong leadership. Yeltsin had to find someone who could restore order, someone who could protect the government and calm the public. But who could do it? Yeltsin's closest advisors discussed many names. They debated, argued, and searched for the right person. At first, no one considered Vladimir Putin. He was quiet and unknown to most of the country. But for those who had worked with him, Putin's qualities stood out. He was loyal, disciplined, and effective. He avoided scandal. He stayed focused on tasks and delivered results. Most importantly, he was trusted. Yeltsin's inner circle admired his ability to stay calm under pressure. Some said he reminded them of old Soviet leaders who valued order above all else. In August 1999, Yeltsin made his decision. He would appoint Putin as prime minister. It was a surprising choice. The public didn't know who Putin was, and many politicians were confused. Why would Yeltsin choose a man with such a low profile? But Yeltsin believed in Putin. He trusted him to protect the legacy of his government and continue reforms. When Yeltsin announced the decision on television, the reaction was mixed. Some thought it was a mistake. Others saw potential in Putin's quiet strength. Reporters asked, "Who is Vladimir Putin?" Few had answers. Putin took his role as prime minister seriously. He knew the challenges ahead. Chechnya was one of his first major tests. The southern region of Russia was in conflict. Separatists wanted independence, and violence had spread across the area. Bombings killed civilians. Attacks on Russian soldiers increased. Yeltsin had struggled to control the situation, but now the responsibility fell on Putin. He acted quickly and decisively. He sent troops into Chechnya to regain control. His approach was tough. Critics said he was too harsh, but many Russians supported his actions. They wanted peace and stability. Putin promised to restore order, and he didn't back down. His determination impressed both the public and political leaders. As the months passed, Putin's influence grew. He wasn't just the man carrying out orders. He was becoming a leader in his own right. He gave speeches, visited military bases, and met with officials. People began to see him as a man who could get things done. His calm, no-nonsense attitude gave them hope. In December 1999, everything changed again. Yeltsin's health had worsened, and he knew he couldn't continue as president. On New Year's Eve, he made a historic announcement. In a televised address, Yeltsin said he was resigning. His voice was tired, but his words were powerful. He apologized to the Russian people, saying, "I am sorry I didn't meet your expectations." Then he named Vladimir Putin as acting president. The nation was stunned. The man who had been prime minister for only a few months was now leading the country. Could he handle it? Could this quiet man take on such responsibility? These questions filled the minds of millions. Putin delivered a short speech after Yeltsin's announcement. His voice was steady but serious. He promised to protect Russia's democracy and continue the path of reform. He thanked Yeltsin for his trust and vowed to work for the people. But deep inside, he must have felt the weight of the moment. The future of Russia now rested on his shoulders. His first days as acting president were busy. He met with ministers, military leaders, and foreign diplomats. Every decision mattered. The media followed his every move. Some critics doubted him. They said he was inexperienced and wouldn't last long. But Putin ignored them. He focused on the job at hand. He knew that proving himself wouldn't come from words. It would come from action. One of his first major tests was the presidential election scheduled for March 2000. To remain in power, Putin needed to win. But he wasn't a natural campaigner. He wasn't charismatic, and he didn't enjoy public attention. Still, he understood the importance of connecting with voters. His team helped craft a simple but powerful message: stability, security, and national pride. Putin visited factories, military bases, and rural towns. He shook hands with workers and listened to their concerns. He spoke about restoring Russia's strength. Many voters liked his message. After years of uncertainty, they wanted a leader who could bring order. His tough stance on Chechnya had already won him support. The image of a strong, determined leader was exactly what many Russians were looking for. But the election wasn't just about public opinion. Behind the scenes, Putin's team worked hard to ensure success. They used their political connections and influence to secure support from key figures. Putin understood how to navigate the political system. He knew that winning an election wasn't just about votes. It was about building alliances. On March 26, 2000, the results came in. Putin had won with over 50% of the vote. He had become Russia's president. The quiet man from St. Petersburg had risen to the top of the nation. His rise had been fast. Some said too fast. But he had proven his ability to lead. As he stood on stage during his inauguration, he looked serious, almost emotionless. But inside, he must have felt the magnitude of the moment. The challenges ahead were enormous. Russia's economy was still weak. Corruption hadn't disappeared, and the world was watching closely. Could Putin deliver on his promises? Could he restore Russia's place as a global power? In his inaugural speech, he spoke of unity and strength. He reminded the nation of its resilience. "We have been through hard times," he said, "but we will rise again." Behind his calm words, there was a man who had learned how to survive chaos. He had navigated political storms and avoided scandal. Now, he would need to apply everything he had learned. The quiet man was no longer in the shadows. He was leading a country of millions, and the world was paying attention. But Putin was ready. At least he believed he was. The question remained, would history remember him as the man who saved Russia or the man who changed it forever? Only time would tell. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 6, Chechnya and the Fight for Control. In 1999, Russia faced a growing threat in Chechnya. The southern region had been fighting for independence for years. Chechen rebels wanted to break free from Russia and create their own state. The First Chechen War, which began in 1994, had already left scars. That war ended in 1996, but peace did not last. By 1999, violence had returned. Bombings, kidnappings, and attacks became common. Russian cities were on edge. People feared the next explosion could be near their homes. Chechen fighters were bold and well-trained. They attacked Russian soldiers and took hostages. Civilians suffered the most. Many homes in Chechnya were destroyed. Families lost loved ones. The conflict wasn't just a political issue. It was a human tragedy. The Russian government, under President Yeltsin, had struggled to contain the violence. But things were about to change. When Vladimir Putin became prime minister in August 1999, Chechnya became his top priority. To many Russians, the situation felt hopeless, but Putin was determined to bring order. He saw the conflict not only as a local problem, but as a threat to Russia's future. "We will destroy the terrorists," he declared. His tone was calm but firm. He didn't promise negotiations or compromises. He promised action. His first test came in September 1999, when a series of bombings shook Russia. Apartment buildings in Moscow, Buyansk, and Volgodonsk were targeted. Hundreds of innocent people were killed. The bombings shocked the nation. Fear spread quickly. People wondered, who is behind this? Russian officials blamed Chechen separatists, though some questioned the government's version of events. The truth behind the attacks remains debated. But one thing was clear. The Russian people wanted revenge. Putin acted swiftly. He sent troops into Chechnya, launching a second war. This time, the strategy was different. The military used heavy airstrikes to weaken the rebels before ground forces moved in. Cities and villages were bombed, and soldiers pushed deep into Chechen territory. Putin gave clear instructions: defeat the enemy and regain control of the region. He didn't accept half measures. The battle for Grozny, Chechnya's capital, was fierce. The city had already suffered during the First War, and now it was under attack again. Russian tanks rolled through the streets. Buildings burned. Civilians tried to flee, but many were trapped the fighting was brutal. By February 2000, Russian forces had captured Grozny, declaring victory. But the cost was high. Thousands of people had died, and much of the city lay in ruins. Back in Moscow, Putin's popularity soared. Many Russians saw him as a hero. He had done what others couldn't. He had taken action and shown strength. After years of chaos and weak leadership, people felt a sense of pride again. They believed Putin could restore Russia's power and bring stability. His tough stance on Chechnya became a symbol of his leadership style: firm, decisive, and unyielding. But not everyone praised him. Human rights organizations condemned the military's actions. They accused Russian forces of committing abuses, including torture, executions, and attacks on civilians. Reports of destroyed homes, missing people, and refugee camps spread quickly. Chechen towns were left in ruins, and families were torn apart. The war was not clean. It was filled with pain, loss, and anger. Internationally, Putin's actions were controversial. Western leaders were divided. Some supported Russia's right to defend itself against terrorism. Others criticized the use of excessive force. In the United States and Europe, news reports showed images of bombed-out cities and suffering civilians. Pressure grew on Putin to explain his actions, but he didn't waver. "We are protecting our nation," he said. To him, Chechnya was more than a war. It was about showing the world that Russia would not be weak. Putin's response to criticism was calculated. He controlled how the war was reported within Russia. The media was restricted. Journalists who tried to investigate human rights abuses were silenced or threatened. Independent news was replaced by state-approved reports showing military victories and patriotic messages. Many Russians believed what they saw on television. To them, Putin was a leader who defended their country, no matter the cost. But beneath the surface, the conflict continued. Even after the Russian military claimed victory, small groups of rebels kept fighting. They hid in the mountains and launched surprise attacks. The violence didn't stop completely, but Putin's mission was clear. The rebellion would not be allowed to grow again. For Putin, Chechnya was more than just a war zone. It was a lesson in power. He learned how to manage crises and control the narrative. He realized that showing strength made people trust him, even if the methods were harsh. His popularity didn't come from making speeches or shaking hands. It came from action. People respected him because they believed he could protect them. The Second Chechen War shaped Putin's image. When he ran for president in 2000, voters remembered how he had handled the conflict. They saw him as a man who could bring stability after years of chaos. His campaign focused on restoring order and pride in Russia. The war had given him the platform he needed to win. But the impact of the war wasn't just political. The people of Chechnya continued to suffer. The region remained unstable, and tensions between Chechens and Russians grew. Years later, memories of the conflict would still haunt many. Some families would never know what happened to their missing relatives. The scars of war don't fade easily. By the end of 2000, Putin had solidified his position as a strong leader. He had shown that he could make tough decisions without hesitation. But the cost of those decisions was high. Thousands had died. Cities had been destroyed. And the world had seen both the strength and brutality of his leadership. As he looked toward the future, Putin knew that this was just the beginning. He had proven himself, but Russia still faced many challenges. Could he continue to lead with strength without losing the trust of his people, or the world's respect? His next moves would decide how history would judge him. For now, the world watched and waited. Chapter 7. Building Power at Home. When Vladimir Putin became president in 2000, Russia was in trouble. The economy was weak. Factories had shut down. Millions of people were unemployed. Wages were low, and many families couldn't afford basic goods. Corruption was everywhere. Wealthy businessmen, known as oligarchs, had taken control of major industries like oil, gas, and steel. They made billions of dollars while ordinary people struggled to survive. The government was unstable, and crime was rising. Putin promised to fix it. He said he would bring stability and order. He told the Russian people that better days were coming. At first, many didn't believe him. They had heard promises before. But Putin was different. He didn't rely on long speeches or emotional words. He relied on action. One of his first moves was to take control of the media. During the 1990s, newspapers, TV stations, and radio channels had operated freely. Journalists reported on political scandals and corruption. They criticized government leaders, including the president. But Putin didn't want that. He believed the media should support the state, not attack it. Slowly, his government took over major TV networks. Independent voices were silenced. Journalists who investigated sensitive topics were pressured to stop. Some were even killed under mysterious circumstances. Soon, most Russians were getting their news from state-controlled media. The news showed positive stories about Putin's leadership. His speeches were broadcast regularly, and his successes were highlighted. Critics called this propaganda, but many Russians didn't mind. They were tired of chaos and wanted a leader who could provide stability. Putin's next target was the oligarchs. These men had gained their wealth in the 1990s by buying state-owned industries at low prices. They became powerful, influencing politics and controlling large parts of the economy. Some even challenged government decisions. Putin saw them as a threat. He wanted to reduce their power and make sure they couldn't interfere with his plans. One of the most famous cases involved Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a billionaire and owner of the oil company Yukos. Khodorkovsky was one of the richest men in Russia. He supported opposition groups and funded politicians who criticized Putin. In 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested. He was charged with fraud and tax evasion. His company was taken apart, and its assets were sold to state-controlled firms. Khodorkovsky was sentenced to prison, where he stayed for years. The message was clear: challenge Putin, and you will face consequences. Other oligarchs saw what happened and backed down. Some moved their wealth abroad. Others agreed to cooperate with the government. Putin allowed them to keep their money as long as they stayed loyal and didn't get involved in politics. With the oligarchs under control, the government had more influence over the economy. As president, Putin worked to improve living conditions. He focused on rebuilding industries, raising wages, and creating jobs. Oil and gas exports brought in billions of dollars, helping the country recover from its economic troubles. Roads were repaired, schools received more funding, and pensions were increased. Many Russians began to feel hopeful again. They believed Putin was delivering on his promises. By the mid-2000s, life had improved for many. Shops were full of goods, and people had money to spend. The middle class grew. Families bought cars, apartments, and vacation trips. Putin's popularity soared. In villages and cities, people praised him as a leader who understood their needs. He gave them pride in their country. After years of humiliation, they felt Russia was strong again. But not everyone was happy. Critics said Putin was becoming too powerful. They accused him of limiting freedom and silencing opposition. They argued that by controlling the media, he was preventing people from knowing the truth. Independent newspapers and online outlets were monitored closely. Some were forced to shut down. Opposition leaders were arrested or had their protests banned. One of the most vocal critics was Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister. Nemtsov warned that Putin was turning Russia into an authoritarian state. He led protests and called for change. But in 2015, Nemtsov was assassinated near the Kremlin. His death shocked the country. Many believed it was a warning to anyone who opposed the government. The investigation into his murder left questions unanswered, fueling suspicion that powerful figures were involved. Despite these events, Putin maintained strong support. Many Russians believed the sacrifices were necessary to rebuild the country. They trusted him to make tough decisions, even if they weren't always fair. For them, stability was more important than freedom. They remembered the chaos of the 1990s and didn't want to return to that time. Putin also focused on promoting Russian nationalism. He spoke about the country's history and its role as a great power. He praised the achievements of past leaders and celebrated military victories. National holidays were emphasized, and symbols of Soviet glory, like parades and monuments, returned to public life. Schools taught students to be proud of their country and respect authority. For many Russians, this renewed sense of pride felt good. But for others, it raised concerns. They worried that nationalism could lead to isolation from the world. One of Putin's key strategies was to keep people dependent on the government. Social programs were expanded, and state-owned companies dominated the economy. This created a system where many jobs and benefits came directly from the state. People who relied on government assistance were less likely to criticize it. They feared losing their income or security. By 2008, Putin had established firm control over Russia. The media was loyal. the oligarchs were quiet, and opposition voices were weakened. But his time as president was coming to an end, at least legally. The Russian constitution limited presidents to 2 consecutive terms. He couldn't run for a 3rd term. But Putin wasn't ready to give up power. He found a solution. Dmitry Medvedev, a close ally, ran for president. Medvedev won the election, but Putin didn't step away. Instead, he became prime minister. Many believed Medvedev was a figurehead, while Putin remained the true leader. This period, known as the tandem leadership, kept Putin in control without breaking the law. During these years, Putin continued to influence every major decision. He worked on modernizing the military, strengthening Russia's role on the global stage, and ensuring the economy stayed stable. But critics argued that democracy was being destroyed. Elections were seen as unfair, with opposition candidates facing obstacles and media bias. By 2012, Putin returned as president. He won easily, but protests erupted in Moscow and other cities. Thousands of people took to the streets, demanding free elections and more political freedom. The protests were some of the largest since the fall of the Soviet Union. But Putin didn't back down. Police cracked down on demonstrations, and opposition leaders faced arrests. Putin had built power carefully. He knew how to manage crises, silence dissent, and maintain support. His strategy of combining economic growth with strict control worked. But was this strategy sustainable? Could he continue to balance development with the suppression of freedom? The answers would come in time. For now, Putin stood firmly at the center of Russian life, admired by many, feared by some, and watched by the world. His journey as a leader was far from over. What lay ahead would test him even further. Chapter 8: Russia and the West. In the early 2000s, Vladimir Putin wanted good relations with the West. Russia was recovering from economic troubles, and cooperation with Europe and the United States seemed important. At the time, world leaders welcomed Putin. He spoke about peace, trade, and security. In 2001, after the September 11th attacks in the U.S., Putin offered help to fight terrorism. He supported the American-led war in Afghanistan. For a moment, it seemed like Russia and the West could be strong allies. Putin met with U.S. President George W. Bush. They smiled for cameras. Bush famously said, "I looked into his eyes and saw his soul." Many believed Putin was a partner in creating a safer world. European leaders, including German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, saw him as someone who could modernize Russia and strengthen ties with the West. But underneath the surface, things were not so simple. Putin's idea of cooperation was different from the West's. He wanted respect and recognition. He believed Russia deserved to be treated as an equal power. The Soviet Union had fallen, but Putin didn't want Russia to be seen as weak or defeated. He wanted it to have influence, just like the US and Europe. At first, leaders tried to understand his position, but tensions quietly began to grow. One major issue was NATO. After the end of the Cold War, NATO, a military alliance between Western countries expanded. Former Soviet allies like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. Later, other countries in Eastern Europe followed, including the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. To the West, this expansion was about protecting new democracies. To Putin, it was something else. It was a threat. He saw NATO's presence near Russia's borders as a danger. To him, it was a sign that the West wanted to surround and control Russia. He believed they didn't trust him. He asked for guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand further, but his requests were ignored. The relationship, which had started with smiles and promises, was now showing cracks. In 2003, another event made things worse. The U.S. invaded Iraq, saying the country had weapons of mass destruction. Russia didn't support the war. Putin believed the invasion was illegal and dangerous. Many Russians saw it as proof that the U.S. was willing to act without international approval. This deepened the divide. Putin began to question whether cooperation with the West was possible. Back in Russia, he worked on strengthening the country's economy and military. The early 2000s were good years for Russia. Oil and gas exports brought in billions of dollars. The country paid off debts and modernized its military. Putin's popularity at home grew, but as he became stronger internally, his view of the West darkened. He saw Western nations not as partners, but as competitors, sometimes even as enemies. One event that shaped his thinking was the color revolutions. These were protests and uprisings in former Soviet states like Ukraine and Georgia. Pro-Western leaders came to power, and Putin believed the West was behind it. To him, these revolutions weren't about democracy. They were about weakening Russia's influence. He feared the same thing could happen inside Russia. He became more suspicious of Western organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, working in his country. Many were accused of trying to spread unrest. In 2007, Putin gave a speech in Munich, Germany. It was a turning point. His words shocked the audience. He accused the U.S. of acting like a global bully. He criticized NATO for expanding and warned that Russia would not be pushed around. His tone was strong and defiant. "We will not be ignored," he said. The West realized that Putin's attitude had changed. The friendly, cooperative leader they had once known was gone. Tensions continued to rise. In 2008, another major conflict erupted. Georgia, a small country near Russia, wanted to join NATO. This angered Putin. When fighting broke out between Georgian forces and separatists in South Ossetia, a region with ties to Russia, Putin acted quickly. Russian troops invaded Georgia and defeated its army in just 5 days. The world watched in shock. Western leaders condemned the invasion, but Putin defended it. He said Russia was protecting its citizens and preventing violence. To him, it was a message to the West: don't interfere in our backyard. The conflict with Georgia was a warning of what was to come. In 2014, the situation escalated further. Ukraine, another former Soviet republic, was at the center of the crisis. Protests in Kyiv led to the removal of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych. A new government, leaning toward Europe and NATO, took over. Putin saw this as another Western attempt to pull a country away from Russia's influence. In response, Russia annexed Crimea, a region of Ukraine with a majority Russian-speaking population. Russian troops, without official identification, took control of key locations. Within weeks, Crimea held a controversial referendum, and the region was declared part of Russia. The West called the annexation illegal and imposed sanctions. The US and Europe froze Russian assets and banned trade with certain companies. Russia's economy was hurt, but Putin didn't back down. The annexation of Crimea made Putin more popular at home. Many Russians saw it as a victory. For them, it was proof that Putin was defending Russian interests. National pride grew, but so did isolation from the West. Relations between Russia and Western countries hit their lowest point since the Cold War. Diplomats tried to ease tensions, but mistrust remained. Western leaders accused Putin of supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine, where fighting continued. They said Russia was providing weapons and troops to the rebels. Putin denied it, but evidence suggested otherwise. The conflict dragged on, with thousands of lives lost. The West responded with more sanctions, and Russia's economy struggled further. By the mid-2000s teens, the divide between Russia and the West seemed permanent. Putin's view of the world was clear. The West wanted to weaken Russia and limit its power. He believed that cooperation was no longer possible. Instead, he focused on building alliances with countries outside the West, like China and Iran. He promoted the idea that Russia could be strong without relying on Europe or the US. At home, state-controlled media painted the West as hostile. News programs showed stories of NATO expansion and anti-Russian protests. Many Russians accepted this narrative. They saw their country as a victim of Western aggression. Putin's approval ratings remained high, despite the sanctions and economic challenges. But not everyone agreed with him. Some Russians, especially in large cities, wanted better relations with the West. They believed isolation would harm the country's future. Opposition leaders called for more cooperation and less conflict. But their voices were often silenced or ignored. By the end of the 2010s, Russia and the West were locked in a cycle of mistrust. Cyber attacks, diplomatic expulsions, and accusations of election interference became common. Each side blamed the other for escalating tensions. Putin, however, seemed confident. He believed that Russia was strong enough to stand on its own. The world watched as the relationship continued to deteriorate. Would it lead to a major conflict, or could diplomacy find a way to repair the damage? The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Putin had changed the way Russia interacted with the world, and the consequences of those changes would be felt for years to come. Chapter 9. The Return to Power. In 2008, Vladimir Putin faced a legal problem. The Russian constitution did not allow him to serve more than 2 consecutive terms as president. He had been in power since 2000, and his time as president had officially ended. Many wondered what he would do next. Would he leave politics? Would he try to change the Constitution? The world watched and waited. Putin had a plan. Instead of stepping away from power, he stayed close. Dmitry Medvedev, a trusted ally, ran for president with Putin's support. Medvedev was not as strong or popular as Putin, but he had one advantage: loyalty. People understood that Medvedev wouldn't act without Putin's influence. When Medvedev won the election in 2008, it didn't feel like a real change. Many believed Putin remained the true leader behind the scenes. Putin became prime minister, officially the second most powerful position in Russia. But in reality, many key decisions still came from him. Medvedev handled the public face of the presidency, but Putin stayed involved in the military, foreign policy, and major economic matters. Together, they formed what people called a tandem leadership. It looked like a partnership, but most knew who was really in charge. During Medvedev's presidency, Russia experienced mixed results. The economy continued to recover after the global financial crisis, thanks to high oil prices. But problems remained. Corruption was still widespread, and ordinary people faced challenges like low wages and poor public services. Protests against government corruption began to grow in some cities. Medvedev, known for his softer approach, tried to modernize the country and improve technology. But critics said he lacked the strength and independence to create real change. In 2011, Medvedev announced that he wouldn't run for re-election. Instead, Putin would be the candidate. This was no surprise to many Russians, but it still caused anger among those who wanted new leadership. To them, it felt like a political game. Medvedev had simply kept the seat warm for Putin's return. They believed the decision had been made without any input from the people. The announcement triggered protests, especially in Moscow. People gathered in the streets, holding signs and chanting slogans. "Russia without Putin," they shouted. They demanded free elections and more political freedom. Thousands marched through the capital, braving the cold winter air. Many were young, educated, and frustrated with the lack of democracy. The protests were some of the largest Russia had seen in years. The energy in the crowd was intense. People believed they could make a difference. But the government didn't listen. State-controlled media downplayed the protests, calling them small and unimportant. Police were sent to break up demonstrations. Hundreds were arrested. Some opposition leaders were fined or jailed. The message was clear. Public dissent would not be tolerated. Despite this, the protests continued. Social media helped spread information, allowing activists to organize quickly. The streets of Moscow became a battleground between protesters and police. Meanwhile, Putin's campaign moved forward. His message was simple: stability, strength, and security. He reminded Russians of the progress made under his leadership. He warned them that without him, the country could return to the chaos of the 1990s. Many voters, especially those in rural areas, believed him. They valued order and feared instability. Older citizens remembered the difficult years after the fall of the Soviet Union. To them, Putin represented a safe choice. On March 4, 2012, the presidential election was held. Putin won easily, securing over 60% of the vote. But many believed the election wasn't fair. Reports of fraud, ballot stuffing, and voter intimidation spread quickly. Independent monitors said the process was flawed. Opposition leaders claimed that the results didn't reflect the true will of the people. After the election, protests grew larger. The crowd in Moscow's Bolotnaya Square was massive. People carried banners reading, "We are the 99%, and Putin is a thief." They accused the government of stealing the election. The atmosphere was tense. Riot police lined the streets, ready to act at any moment. Protesters shouted slogans and waved Russian flags, but they were met with force. Clashes broke out, and dozens were arrested. Many were dragged away while chanting, "Freedom for Russia." Despite the public anger, Putin remained calm. He dismissed the protests as the work of troublemakers influenced by foreign governments. He accused the West of funding opposition movements to weaken Russia. "They want to divide us," he said. His supporters repeated this message, and many Russians believed it. State television showed images of protesters clashing with police, portraying them as violent and dangerous. This helped to strengthen support for Putin among more conservative voters. Putin's inauguration took place in May 2012. He entered the Kremlin, wearing a black suit and a serious expression. His hand rested on a copy of the Russian Constitution as he took the oath of office. Outside, security was tight. The streets were quiet, but not because people were celebrating. Protesters had been blocked from gathering near the ceremony. The scene was symbolic. Power remained firmly in Putin's hands, and dissent was pushed aside. As president again, Putin focused on consolidating his power. He introduced new laws limiting protests and restricting the activities of non-governmental organizations. Foreign-funded groups had to register as foreign agents, making it harder for them to operate. Journalists who criticized the government faced threats and legal action. The message was clear. Opposition would not be tolerated. But why were so many people afraid of Putin's return? For some, it wasn't just about politics. They feared losing their voice. They felt trapped in a system where their opinions didn't matter. Young people, in particular, were frustrated. They wanted freedom of speech, fair elections, and the ability to shape their country's future. Many saw Putin as a symbol of the past, someone who would keep Russia stuck in an era of control and repression. At the same time, others trusted him. To them, he was a protector who could defend Russia from external threats. They believed that the West was trying to weaken the country through sanctions and interference. Putin's strong stance against the West made them feel proud. They admired his ability to stand firm even when faced with criticism. For many, national pride mattered more than political freedom. Putin's return marked the beginning of a new chapter in Russian politics. He wasn't just a leader now. He was a symbol of stability and power. But the divisions in Russian society were growing. On one side were those who wanted change and more democracy. On the other were those who valued order and trusted Putin to keep the country strong. As the protests faded and arrests continued, the question remained: would Putin's grip on power ever weaken? Or had he built a system so strong that no one could challenge him? The answer would depend on events still to come. For now, Putin was back, and Russia would follow his lead, whether willingly or not. Chapter 10: Crimea and Global Reactions. In February 2014, Ukraine faced a major crisis. Its capital, Kyiv, was filled with protests. Thousands of people gathered in the streets, demanding change. They wanted the country to move closer to Europe, not Russia. Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, had rejected a trade deal with the European Union. Instead, he accepted a loan from Russia. This decision angered many Ukrainians. Protests turned violent. The government cracked down, but the protests continued. Eventually, Yanukovych fled the country. A new, pro-European government took control. Vladimir Putin watched these events closely. To him, Ukraine was more than a neighboring country. It was part of Russia's history and sphere of influence. He believed the West had supported the protests to weaken Russia's power. He saw the new government in Kyiv as a threat. But what could he do? In Crimea, a region of Ukraine with strong ties to Russia, the situation became tense. Most people there spoke Russian and identified with Russian culture. Many did not support the new Ukrainian government. They feared that their rights would be taken away. Putin saw an opportunity. He claimed that Russian speakers in Crimea were in danger and needed protection. He acted quickly. In late February 2014, armed men without military insignias appeared in Crimea. They wore masks and carried weapons. These soldiers moved fast, taking control of government buildings, airports, and military bases. They blocked roads and surrounded Ukrainian forces. Although they had no official markings, it became clear they were Russian soldiers. Russia denied this at first, calling them local self-defense groups. But the world knew the truth. Within days, Crimea was under Russian control. A pro-Russian government was installed. They announced a referendum, an official vote on whether Crimea should join Russia. The vote was held in March 2014. Official results showed that over 95% of voters supported joining Russia. But the referendum was controversial. Many believed it wasn't fair. Some said voters were pressured, and others pointed out that the vote was organized under military occupation. Despite the controversy, Putin acted swiftly. He signed a treaty annexing Crimea, officially making it part of Russia. In a speech, he defended the move, saying it was necessary to protect Russian speakers. He talked about Crimea's long history with Russia. "Crimea has always been ours," he said. His words stirred national pride. In Russia, people cheered. They waved flags, sang songs, and celebrated what they saw as a victory. But the world reacted differently. Western countries, including the United States, Canada, and members of the European Union, condemned the annexation. They called it a violation of international law. Crimea was legally part of Ukraine, and no country had the right to take it by force. Western leaders accused Russia of aggression and warned of consequences. Sanctions were quickly imposed. The U.S. and the EU targeted Russian officials, businesses, and banks. They froze assets, banned travel, and restricted trade. Major Russian companies, especially those connected to energy and finance, were hit hard. Foreign investment slowed, and the Russian economy struggled. The value of the ruble dropped, and prices for everyday goods rose. For ordinary Russians, life became more expensive. But Putin's popularity remained high. Why did so many Russians continue to support him despite the economic hardship? For many, the annexation of Crimea was a moment of pride. After years of feeling ignored or disrespected by the West, they saw this as a sign that Russia was strong again. State-controlled media played a big role in shaping public opinion. News channels showed images of happy Crimean citizens welcoming Russian soldiers. They called it a peaceful reunification, not an invasion. Putin was portrayed as a protector, someone who stood up to the West and defended Russian interests. But outside Russia, the story was different. Western media showed images of Ukrainian soldiers surrounded by armed men. They interviewed Crimean residents who said they had been forced to vote or felt scared to speak out. Many Western leaders compared Putin's actions to Cold War tactics, accusing him of trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. Some feared that Crimea was just the beginning. Would Putin target other parts of Ukraine or neighboring countries? In eastern Ukraine, conflict soon followed. Pro-Russian separatists, inspired by the events in Crimea, began fighting Ukrainian forces. They wanted their regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, to break away and join Russia. The Ukrainian government tried to regain control, but the situation escalated. Russia was accused of secretly supporting the separatists with weapons and troops. Putin denied direct involvement, but evidence suggested otherwise. As the conflict in eastern Ukraine worsened, the international community became more divided. Countries like the U.S. and Britain called for stronger sanctions, while others, like Germany and France, tried to find a diplomatic solution. Talks were held, agreements were signed, but the fighting continued. Thousands of people were killed, and entire towns were destroyed. Millions were displaced, fleeing their homes in search of safety. The annexation of Crimea marked a turning point in Putin's relationship with the world. Before 2014, he had been seen as a strong but practical leader. Now he was viewed as unpredictable and dangerous. Western leaders no longer trusted him. Diplomatic ties were strained. Russia was suspended from the G8, a group of the world's most powerful economies. International meetings became tense, with Western leaders openly criticizing Putin. But Putin didn't back down. He insisted that he had done the right thing. He argued that Crimea had always belonged to Russia and that the West was trying to isolate his country. He used the sanctions as proof that Western nations were enemies, determined to weaken Russia. His rhetoric became more nationalist. He spoke about defending Russian culture, values, and traditions from foreign influence. Inside Russia, this message worked. Even those who struggled with rising prices and fewer job opportunities often blamed the West, not Putin. The idea that Russia was under attack from outside forces made people rally around their leader. Putin used this to strengthen his control. Opposition voices were silenced, protests were restricted, and independent media faced more pressure. Years later, the annexation of Crimea continued to affect global politics. It reshaped relations between Russia and the West, creating a new era of mistrust. For some, it was proof of Putin's ambition to expand Russian influence. For others, it was an act of self-defense, a response to Western interference. The debate over whether Putin was protecting his country or expanding it never ended. But one thing was certain. Putin had changed the world. The events of 2014 set off a chain reaction, leading to new conflicts, alliances, and tensions. As the years passed, the question remained, how far would Putin go to defend what he saw as Russia's rightful place in the world? And could the West stop him if he did? The answers were unclear, but one thing was sure: history would never forget Crimea. Chapter 11: Controversy and Control. Vladimir Putin's time in power changed Russia in many ways. When he became president in 2000, the country was struggling. The economy was weak and people were tired of instability. But over the next decade, things began to improve. Oil and gas exports brought in money. Wages increased and new jobs were created. Roads were built and cities modernized. Many Russians felt proud of their country again. They believed that Putin had saved them from chaos. But not everyone agreed. Critics said that the improvements came at a high cost. They argued that Putin's government wasn't just building the economy, it was building a system of control. Step by step, freedom in Russia shrank. At first, it happened quietly. Independent newspapers and TV channels faced pressure. Some were bought by companies close to the government. Others were shut down. By the mid-2000s, most major media outlets were under state control. Television played a key role. For many Russians, it was their main source of news. State-run TV showed positive stories about Putin. His speeches were broadcast regularly. Critics of the government received little airtime, and their opinions were often ignored. The media created an image of Putin as a strong, reliable leader. To millions, he was the man who had restored stability and order. But to others, he was silencing dissent. Journalists who tried to report on corruption or government abuses faced risks. Some were threatened, others lost their jobs, a few were killed. One of the most famous cases was Anna Politkovskaya. She was a journalist who wrote about human rights abuses in Chechnya. She criticized the military's actions and accused officials of covering up crimes. In 2006, she was shot dead in her apartment building. Her murder shocked the world. Many believed it was a warning to other journalists. Putin denied any involvement, but the message was clear. Those who challenged the system were not safe. Over time, fewer people dared to speak out. The independent press became smaller, and the government's control grew stronger. State-run media promoted the idea that opposition leaders were dangerous or supported by foreign enemies. Many Russians believed this narrative, making it harder for opposition groups to gain support. Putin's control extended beyond the media. He targeted political opponents and activists. One of the most high-profile cases was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a billionaire and head of the oil company Yukos. Khodorkovsky supported opposition parties and criticized Putin's government. In 2003, he was arrested on charges of tax evasion and fraud. His company was broken apart, and he was sent to prison for more than a decade. To Putin's supporters, this showed that no one was above the law. But critics saw it as a political move. They believed Khodorkovsky was punished for challenging Putin. The message to other businessmen was clear: stay out of politics or face consequences. Most oligarchs took the warning seriously. They kept their wealth, but avoided interfering with the government. Opposition leaders also faced challenges. Boris Nemtsov, a former deputy prime minister, became one of Putin's most vocal critics. He led protests and called for free elections. He accused the government of corruption and warned that Putin's leadership was becoming dangerous. But in 2015, Nemtsov was assassinated near the Kremlin. His death shocked many. Some believed it was a targeted killing meant to silence the opposition. Putin denied any connection to Nemtsov's death, but the pattern was hard to ignore. Political opponents were often jailed, attacked, or forced into exile. Protests were restricted by new laws, and organizers faced heavy fines. The government monitored social media and online communication. Bloggers who posted anti-government messages risked being arrested. Despite these restrictions, protests continued. In 2011, thousands of people marched in Moscow, demanding fair elections. They chanted slogans like "Russia without Putin" and carried signs calling for change. The protests were peaceful, but the police responded with force. Hundreds of demonstrators were arrested. Many were fined or imprisoned. The government's message was clear: protests would not be tolerated. State-controlled media portrayed the protesters as troublemakers influenced by foreign powers. They showed images of police maintaining order and claimed that most Russians supported the government. For many citizens, this narrative worked. They believed that opposition movements were dangerous and that Putin was protecting the country. Putin's leadership style divided opinions. Inside Russia, many admired him. They credited him with rebuilding the economy and restoring national pride. They appreciated his strong stance against the West, especially after the annexation of Crimea. They believed that Russia needed a powerful leader to defend its interests. To them, Putin was a protector, but others feared him. They saw his rule as authoritarian, not democratic. They argued that elections were unfair and that political opponents had no real chance to compete. They warned that Putin's control over the media, courts, and police made it impossible for ordinary citizens to speak out. For them, Russia was becoming a place where power was concentrated in the hands of one man. Outside Russia, opinions of Putin were also mixed. Western leaders accused him of undermining democracy and violating human rights. They imposed sanctions after the annexation of Crimea and criticized his support for pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine. But Putin didn't back down. He saw these criticisms as part of a broader strategy to weaken Russia. He believed that Western nations wanted to limit Russia's power and influence. To many Russians, this made him even more popular. State-controlled media painted him as a hero defending the country against external threats. People were reminded of Russia's history, how it had survived invasions, wars, and sanctions before. They believed it could survive again under Putin's leadership. But the future was uncertain. The economy faced challenges, especially after oil prices fell. Sanctions continued to hurt businesses and limited foreign investment. Some Russians began to feel the pressure. They worried about rising prices and fewer job opportunities. Even loyal supporters questioned whether the government had a plan for long-term growth. At the same time, opposition groups adapted. They used social media to spread their messages, bypassing state-controlled TV. Young activists organized online campaigns and street protests. They knew that challenging Putin's system wouldn't be easy, but they believed change was possible. By the late 2010s, the world was watching Putin closely. His influence had grown beyond Russia's borders. He had played a key role in conflicts in Ukraine and Syria. He was accused of interfering in Western elections and using cyber attacks to disrupt other countries. Some saw him as a master strategist, while others viewed him as a dangerous leader. Was Putin a protector of his nation, or was he building a dictatorship? The answer depended on who you asked. Inside Russia, the debate continued. Some praised him for creating stability and restoring pride. Others warned that his system of control would eventually collapse. As time went on, one thing became clear. Putin's leadership had left a deep mark on Russia. Whether history would remember him as a hero or a ruler who silenced his people remained to be seen. But for now, his power remained strong, and the world continued to watch his every move, waiting to see what would happen next. Chapter 12. A Legacy. Unfolding. Vladimir Putin's story is not over. His life and leadership have shaped Russia in ways that will be studied for generations. From his rise as a quiet man from Leningrad to his position as one of the world's most powerful leaders, his journey has been filled with decisions that changed history. In the early 2000s, Russia was in chaos. The economy was weak and people were frustrated. Factories were closed and corruption was everywhere. But Putin promised to fix it. He brought stability. He controlled the oligarchs and improved the economy using money from oil and gas exports. Roads were rebuilt, cities were modernized, and many Russians felt hopeful for the first time in years. For many, Putin became a